Hello, this is Shane, and I'm the general manager of the OpenChain project. Welcome to one of our monthly meetings. This is the one with a schedule suitable for people in North America as well as Europe. Before we start the meeting today, I'm going to show our antitrust policy slides. We show this at the beginning of every Linux Foundation meeting. You can read the full antitrust policy on our website. And if you're from a member company of the Linux Foundation, you can contact our counsel, Andy Updegrove, with any questions you might have. Now, on this monthly meeting, we're going to have a compressed schedule. A lot of the people who participate in our monthly calls are at the Open Source Summit Japan event, which is just after concluding here in Japan, and they'll be taking part in the Open Source Summit adjacent event called Open Compliance Summit. Most of those people will not be on this call because it is 1 a.m. here in Japan. So our audience is expected to be a little bit limited. And because of that, we'll also have a more compressed schedule on this call. The formal regular agenda for the monthly calls of OpenChain is shown here. Introductions, specification news, SBOM news, OSPO news, automation news, then work on standards and core material, work on reference and supporting material, if time permits, work around supporting other projects, any other business, and close of meeting. Let's get started today with the introductions. So just to introduce myself, I'm Shane Coughlin, the General Manager of the OpenChain project. I'll call out your name, and if you could just introduce yourself by your full name and your company, that would be great. So first of all, Frank.
Yeah, hello, Frank here. I'm from Germany and I'm working for Public Plan.
Good to have
Düsseldorf.
Leonard. Just so you know, everyone is currently muted. You have to unmute yourself to do the introductions. Moving on, we can come back to Leonard later. Mary.
Yes, I'm Mary Wang, and I'm from Volvo Cars.
Hi there, Mary.
Hey.
Moving on, Rakesh.
Hi, this is Rakesh Prabhakaran, and I'm from Bosch, India.
Welcome on board. It's good to have you here.
Thank
Ria?
you.
Hi, this is Ria Shaunat. I'm from HPE.
Good to have you here. Leonard just let us know that he is not able to use his microphone today. That's Leonard Sack from BMW, our board member from BMW. Nathan.
Oh, we're doing intros. Hi, I'm Nathan Kumagai with Qualcomm. So
good to have you here.
Great to be here today.
And finally, Stephen.
All right, just chasing around for the unmute button as usual. Hi, I'm Stephen Kilbane. I'm from Analog Devices in Edinburgh in Scotland.
Great to have you here as well. So because we're on a compressed schedule and it's 1 a.m. and I'm tired, I'm going to put our specification news, our SBOM news, our OSPO news, and automation news into one slide. So in the last two meetings, we had one at the beginning of November and mid-November. We had various news items about events and so on and releases. So in SBOM, we had SPDX 2.3 coming out. With OSPO news, we had, for instance, a webinar from To Do Group about creating policies with automation. And when it came to our specification news, OpenChain talked about how our recently released security specification had self-certification in English and traditional and simplified Chinese. In the last couple of weeks, we actually haven't had a tremendous amount of news in these areas. So the summary is that the biggest news for all of these topics has been that the Open Source Summit Japan event, which just took place, had a track which covered a lot of OSPO, automation, and SBOM information. And tomorrow we'll have a huge amount of topics on the specifications for compliance and security of OpenChain, and software bill of materials, and some digging into automation options. There have been no pivotal changes in the last 2 weeks around any of these items, with one exception. In Korea, there is a project maintained by LG Electronics called Foslight, and Foslight was awarded an Innovation Award in Korea for providing a combined license scanner and hub for software analysis. So this is an automation tool. It's called Foslight. You can search for it on the internet as Foslight Project. And Foslight is something that provides a potential alternative to proprietary tools like Black Duck Hub. Created by LG Electronics, it's also used by Line and Etri, and it's been in practical deployment for almost a decade before becoming an open source project. So I'd flag that as the main item in recent times on these topic bases. Now we are moving straight into the practical side of let's do some work. And while I want to keep this call short, I don't want to make this call unimportant. And for that reason, I want to give us a topic that is of critical importance when it comes to working on our specifications. I want to talk about something in our license compliance specification. This is our ISO standard, ISO 5230. And I want to talk about section 1, the most fundamental section, scope of the standard. Back a few years ago, we had a suggestion from Andrew Katz. This suggestion was put in place on the document that would become the ISO standard, and it was deferred for discussion at that time because we'd already locked down what would be the ISO standard. And Andrew suggested we should change the scope of the ISO standard. He suggested that the current scope talked about software solutions comprised of open source. And he said that this suggests that the supplied software is exclusively open source. And it should reflect reality better if the output was talking about containing open source. So he was suggesting in our scope, we should change from comprised to containing open source. Now, this might sound nitpicky, but this is a change of the most fundamental scope of the OpenChain ISO standard. So section 1 highlighted here. Andrew's proposal, first submitted in October 2019, was to change the scope from saying this was something that talked about defining the key requirements of a quality open source compliance program, to provide a benchmark about building trust between organizations, exchanging software solutions comprised of open source software. And he suggests we change that word comprised to saying containing. And he suggests we do that because comprised could infer that it only contains open source software, and containing is potentially more accurate because the software, of course, could be proprietary and open source as a mix.
I think it depends on if you're a patent attorney or not, because comprising just means including, and it doesn't necessarily mean limited to in patent lingo.
A very good point. A very good point, Ria. And in that case, if we have the patent optic, that should be fine, right? The read should be clear.
Well, not necessarily, because if there's ambiguity in how you interpret it, then that would suggest there isn't clarity, because either this is a major change in scope or it's not. I personally agree with Andrew's suggestion, because when I was reviewing the security spec, I had exactly the same thought, because it's got exactly the same language in here. And if you take the view that, well, if you're a patent attorney, then it doesn't actually make a difference, then changing it to say containing rather than comprising would make it more clear for people who don't have that view, while not changing it to people who do. If that makes sense.
It's a good question. And hypothetically then, for a patent attorney, if we have any patent attorneys on the call, would containing have a disadvantage as opposed to saying comprised?
Well, I just looked up the dictionary definition of comprise, and the first definition is include. The second one is contain or consist, which is a more limiting. So I can see where there could be a potential area for confusion if you're not looking at it through the patent lens. And if people feel the word include or contain is more colloquial or more easy to understand or just clear, then I have no problem with it.
So what we're going to do then is just ask others on the call if you have any input on this. What we're looking for here then is essentially we have a chance to alter the language for potential clarity. And the two options in play are it might introduce clarity or it might not. And more feedback is needed. Jacob, you've got your hand up. Over to you.
Yeah, so I just want to bring up the point you brought earlier that it is at the top of the specification, the scope. And I'm just wondering if this one isn't so clear that we could decide at the moment. Do we understand the effects of the other portions of this, the standard that this will have an effect on? Like,
Absolutely, great question. The answer is the rest of the standard doesn't really refer back to this, except just to use the term comprise as opposed to contain. So if we change the term, it won't change the functional activity of the rest of the standard, but it might change people's mental modeling or reasoning as they read it, but it wouldn't change the fundamental activities or process requirements of the rest of the standard.
okay, that's a great point then.
And the reason I'm curious to get as much feedback as possible on this call, and to be clear, what we do on this call will not edit the standard. It will just make a note on GitHub. But the reason I want to do this is because we are looking at 0.1 of the standard.
From my end, I think this follows the spirit of what we're trying to do originally. So yeah, I'm supportive of the change too.
So from comprise to contain.
Yeah.
Okay. And I must admit that I worked in the patent area for so long with OIN and so on that for comprise, I had the same reading as Ria pointed out. I just read it as being the same, but I can understand if people come at this with a different optic, we want the utmost clarity so that they are guided in the right way. All right, is there any other feedback here on this item? And again, this is literally where people will begin reading the spec, comprise versus contain.
Shane, so I have a point here. So I think, according to me, comprise and contain both pretty much means the same. But to have more clarity, maybe if readers want more clarity, we could introduce something like some additional words. Let's say comprise of open source, but not limited to, something like that, so that it becomes more clear for those who wants the precise meaning of it. Just a thought. because I think as someone pointed out, each words or each synonym has a different meaning depending on the different geography. So just to make it precise, maybe we could think of adding more words.
Thank you very much for your notes, Rakesh. And we have 2 more notes. One, Jacob, your hand is up, and then I'll go to a written note from Mary as well.
Yeah. So if it wasn't clear in my last comment, I do believe this follows the spirit of the specification. And if I recall correctly, from the 2021 Open Compliance Summit, there was a ton of questions, probably the most amount of questions on Andrew Katz's presentation, specifically around this, the mixing of open source software and closed source software. So I think it's an important point.
Before we go to the written point, I'm just going to note that Ria has her hand up. So Ria, over to you again.
The only question I have is not so much on the English debate of this, but I know that you translate a lot of these things into other languages, Shane. And does this change have any effect, or would it create more confusion in other languages or ambiguity, etc.?
I can only speak to a couple of languages, but probably in translations into Japanese and German, correct me if I'm wrong, Leonard, contain might be a little bit easier for non-specialists to translate.
Yes, I think you are right. I think in Chinese, we only have one word for this. It's the same for both contain and comprise. But usually for non-English speaking, I'm used to have contain. It's quite direct forward. And the comprise a little bit official.
Great feedback, Mary. And the written note we had was also from Mary, where she noted that comprise is a synonym of contain, so that, comprise is to be made up of, consist of, and contain is to hold inside. So essentially then both words can mean the same, but it would appear that, for example, in Japanese, in Chinese, the word contain might be easier to translate without specialist knowledge. Belinda notes that it can be simple as contains. So again, going for contains. Okay, so not to jump the gun too much here, but we seem to have on this call a bias towards using contain as a phrase which means the same thing, but appears to be easier for a broader and non-native audience to understand.
I think so.
All right, that's really useful feedback. So what I'll do is I will add a note on GitHub with that information. I will not close the issue, but I will basically put down that suggesting the change to contains makes sense based on this call, because the clarity for people, particularly in different languages, appears to be more intuitive and immediate. People might have a different opinion. They might prefer a different language, and they should definitely introduce that point and counterpoint into the GitHub or email or on the calls in the future. Leonard, we couldn't get your opinion because you just noted again you have trouble with microphone access. If you disagree, please note we're not making a decision. We're just going to make a note that we appear to have a preference on this call to alter the scope from comprise to contains open source software, which should mean the same thing, actually not change the scope, just use a word that might be easier for more people to understand what we mean. All right, great stuff. If we're close to closing an issue for 2009, oh, Leonard agrees. Okay, great feedback, Leonard, thank you. So there we have confirmation that Potentially in German, Japanese, and Chinese, this might be a solution that just makes it a little easier to read the English version of the standard and translate it. All right, everyone, great feedback on that. And today we're going to limit our activity to one more note, one more exploration, which is going to be, here we go, compliance artifacts. Okay, this is an interesting one. And this is another topic where we're probably not going to find any resolution, but we might share some interesting notes. This is from 2020, and it is a note from Hans over at Bosch. And he's talking about the reference in our license spec, talking about reasonable commercial efforts to make sure that compliance is correct. And he's pointing out the reference to reasonable efforts should not be there because the law applies strict liability. I just want to preface this. Hans is talking about his optic of the law in Germany. Okay. And in another jurisdiction like the US, it's very common to use language like reasonable commercial effort, which suggests you've done your best, which is fair enough as an entity. Hans has the point that generally in worldwide copyright law forbids copying, modifying, and distribution without permission. So he's suggesting that using reasonable is not appropriate as opposed to saying ensure or just do it. So he's saying that change it from reasonable commercial efforts to ensure the compliance artifacts have been provided with the correct information for identified licenses. So for those catching up, when we talk about compliance artifacts, we currently talk about reasonable commercial efforts to prepare the compliance artifacts. Hans is saying that we should just say, rather than ensure reasonable efforts have been done, just say ensure the compliance artifacts have been prepared. This triggered a discussion, and I'm going to put in the chat a link to the discussion. Doing that right now. Oh, sorry, that should have gone in the chat. There we go. This triggered a discussion where Jeremiah said he thought removing reasonable commercial effort and just putting ensure was a good idea because it removed the open to interpretation aspect. We're having some comments in the chat. Leonard noted that just going to ensure is probably better. Hillary noted that if something is already strictly required by law, why does it need to be duplicated here? Both are great points. So Leonard, ensure, understand that you like that because it's just simple. Instead of saying ensure reasonable commercial efforts are done, it just says ensure compliance artifacts are included. Hillary, the reason that we said ensure the compliance artifacts are included is in some ways the spec acts as a process checklist. So the idea there was that the spec would contain the information, saying that you must ensure the compliance artifacts as required by the license are provided. So that's why that item was there as an action item. I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to, but that was my read of your note. If I'm incorrect, please let me know. Stephen, hands up.
So I think David makes a reasonable comment because the specification is about the process, the program you put in place. The law is referring to whether you fulfilled your license obligations or not. The law does not say anything about what your process is. So you can have a process that provides reasonable effort in order to fulfill your legal obligations. Those legal obligations are either fulfilled or not. Agree, that is binary. But the law does not require you to have processes to any given particular level. You can comply with law without having any process at all, and vice versa.
That's a really good point, Stephen. And I think that was something that our previous chair of SPEC, Mark Giese, pointed out. He was just saying, to David Rudin's note, David's reading is correct. The spec is focused on a program. So when the spec says something is required or ensure something, it's referring to our program. So ensure the program does X, Y, and Z, as opposed to talking to the actual law itself per se. It's talking about the process to support what you're doing around compliance. Okay. So assuming then that we are comfortable with the spec, basically listing out, certain action items, ensure that you have compliance artifacts, and we interpret the spec as positioned as referring to the program. So it's saying ensure that your program requirement 3.2.1 in this case, ensure that your program has the correct compliance artifacts for the supplied software. It's a process requirement saying that if you're following the spec, here's the checklist of items that we want you to have in place. For this reason, it's not about the law per se. It's about the checklist of items that we think you should have in place, which will enable you to have the processes that enable you in turn to follow your requirements under the licenses and law. So it's setting you up to succeed. So if we assume all of that is okay, then the question is, does the phrase ensure reasonable commercial efforts need to exist in that form, or do we just say ensure? My read from the very few initial comments is that instead of saying ensure reasonable commercial efforts have been done for this process, we just say ensure that this effort has been done for the process. And it appears there's a slight trend so far in favor of that. Are the rest of you on this call, if you're willing to step forward right now, you don't have to, but do you think removing commercial efforts and just say ensure? So we just chop out reasonable commercial efforts and we just say ensure that this is being done. Does that work for you? Is that an improvement in clarity? Hillary would prefer retain commercial efforts. Frank would prefer to chop it down to just ensure. So we now have a tie. We've got Nathan and Stephen unmuted. Nathan, you first.
Sure. I tend to lean in the favor of retaining it. It's always been a tough line to walk about focusing on the process instead of outcomes. And we want to make sure this remains an on-ramp for people who are starting from zero, with a lot of our people have done to coming up to speed here. So I think this language helps it stay focused on the process side.
That's a good point. And we are lifting from zero a lot of the time. A lot of people have nothing in place when they come to us. So we're the first touch they have to the process management here. Stephen, you're unmuted. Over to you.
I agree with that point, and I think if the argument for taking out reasonable suggests to me that it is an argument for unreasonable. Having the same requirement placed on a 1 or 2 person organization as opposed to a 50,000 person organization seems a little extreme. But what I'm curious about actually is, what is commercial doing there? What's that intended to achieve?
That's a really good point. So I think that, just to clarify on that point, we've always positioned the spec as essentially being a company spec. So the spec has been positioned as something that corporations adopt. And
I've generally seen it as being one that's adopted by organizations and not necessarily commercial. And I agree that OpenChain is being geared towards, supporting industry generally and solving industry problems. But, academic and other collaborative open source groups, etc., are also looking towards this. I mean, if you take Eclipse, for example, Foundation.
Yep. They adopted it, the whole foundation,
Yeah.
all the projects, yeah.
But I don't actually know what a commercial effort means.
A very good point. And it may also be something that might be tied slightly to geography and legal practice in geographies, where it's a very common language in the US, but not necessarily always elsewhere. Mary, over to you.
I prefer not to have the commercial because I don't think it's that much related. It's part of it. It can be commercial, can be not commercial. Like it can be a company's effort or organization's effort. It can be a government or community like this. So all kind of this variant efforts.
A very good.
So why is only commercial here? That's my opinion.
Thank you, Mary. It aligns with Stephen as well. Good note. Rankish, you have your hand up. Over to you.
Yes, Shane. So I think I align with Stephen and also Mary because as Mary mentioned, it could be commercial or non-commercial. And depending on the maturity of the organization, the effort could also vary. Like somebody who's, like you mentioned, who's starting from the ground may need like more effort. But somebody who is already has a matured model and has a lot of automations in place and in-house tools might not have a commercial effort. So I think I just agree with Mary and Stephen.
Great point. And we had a couple of notes in the chat. Jacob likes the current language, so reasonable commercial efforts. Frank found that just using ensure is clearer in German. Belinda liked ensure too, but Hillary started to split the effort where I was going to suggest it. I was going to say, what about if we took the traditional British method of trying to find a solution where everyone is equally unhappy? And in doing so, what if we use the phrasing ensure reasonable efforts are made, dropping commercial? Hillary suggested that retaining reasonable effort could support things like Nathan's point about onboarding, but she has no attachment to the commercial qualifier. But she read it as being introduced as a term of art in some markets. In other words, for instance, in the US, it's a very common phrase. Meanwhile, Hillary noted that the black and white of just saying ensure as opposed to ensure reasonable effort or reasonable commercial effort, that might be holding entities to an impossible standard. Ria liked reasonable efforts and said commercial might be confusing given the recent comments. And Frank noted that reasonable efforts might work with him as well. They'd work for him. So it sounds like we have a little bit of a majority against ensure reasonable commercial efforts are made. Some favor towards saying ensure the efforts are made, and a strong compromise suggested in saying ensure reasonable efforts are made. In other words, delete the phrase ensure, delete the word commercial and change from ensure reasonable commercial efforts are made into ensure reasonable efforts are made. And that would allow the interpretation market basis and the interpretation not to be tied to commercial entities. So that change would be just to delete the word commercial here, and it would be a compromise between the current language and the stronger language suggested by Hans. Does anyone have an objection to us taking this middle road and looking for that equal in happiness between all parties. All right. I'm seeing essentially we had, Ria, Hillary, and Frank say that reasonable efforts seem to work. I don't see any phrases against it. So I will prepare an update that moving from ensure reasonable commercial efforts have been instituted into ensure reasonable efforts have been instituted appears to have the positive view for the people on this call. Does anyone strongly object to that?
Shane, it's not an objection, but then I think somebody asked in the beginning of this discussion that what does that effort refers to? So in the scope, or let's say in the document, do we have this somewhere, like what are we referring to in this 3.4.1 as efforts?
We do not define what a reasonable effort is in the document. We left that up to interpretation based on entity and market.
Okay.
Now, I just want to put a proviso here that we do leave a lot of things open to interpretation purposefully, because, for example, what's reasonable in one market could be very different in another market. That doesn't mean that it will automatically always work. So hypothetically, country A could have a different idea of reasonable to country B, but your supply chain could cross both countries, and you could end up with a situation where one supplier is giving you something from country A into country B, and you're thinking, hey, this does not meet my requirements. You have to go back to the supplier and say, fix this. So we are aware it's not a perfect solution, but the other option would be to make the standard very heavy and prescriptive, where we define everything outside of legal jurisdiction interpretation. And the cost of alienation was something that previously was discussed as unwanted.
I agree to that change.
All right. Our result then, which I think is a really good result, a great talk. It's good that we had a lot of different opinions on this, is that we move into a compromise. We change from ensure reasonable commercial efforts have been made into ensure reasonable efforts have been made. We don't go all the way into just saying ensure that this has been done, because we see that as potentially a little bit too high a bar, and maybe an unnecessary bar to put in place. I will update GitHub to reflect that. Amazingly, on this call now, we've actually provided what might be resolution on two of the most thorny points. What is the scope of the ISO standard improvement to help especially non-native speaker translations? And number two, compliance artifacts. What's the requirement there? So these are two huge things we've discussed. Now, because the Open Compliance Summit is starting in a few hours, I want to do something unusual. And my apologies to Nathan here on education. Nathan, if it's okay with you, I'd like to wrap up around here at the 40-minute mark, as opposed to continuing another 20 minutes of editing, because we're going to have to kick off the Open Compliance Summit in just a few hours here in Japan. Is that okay? Or is there an edit item that you really want to get done for education work group today?
No, that's just fine. Wanted to get a bit of advice, but I can do that in the next.
You can just, I can throw the floor open to you for that. That's very welcome if you want.
Well, sure, maybe I can just take 3 minutes.
Yeah, over to you.
Thank you. So one of the things I've been struggling with a bit is how to make the education materials, or at least the editing part, accessible for everyone. I think GitHub and moving things to Markdown is great for having like like a single place and single format for translating and viewing everything. But I think having kind of back and forth discussion on things that maybe aren't as fine points as what we're talking about here on the spec, but more about ideas, ways to simplify language, tend to be better in say like a Google Docs format that I suggested at a previous meeting. So I know that leaves out certain parts of the community who can't reach those, but I think yeah. So my initial thought was, hey, I'd like to move some of the working documents over to Google Docs, and then also kind of pick out a few that need to be focused on. So I wanted to suggest that, or I wanted to ask, would it be more helpful to have, say, like just a separate hour working meeting that people can join in on? Which I know based on time and language would be somewhat limited as well. So does anyone have any ideas about maybe the best way to do that? Is like the Google Docs format okay, or would anyone like to see a working session?
Nathan, my take is that in the end, the only important thing is productivity. So if Google Docs are going to help people just brainstorm and collaborate, then that sounds good. If it helps your workflow, we can convert back into Markdown for each like draft, release, and so on, and then final release.
Okay.
There was a note from Stephen that he doesn't follow the objection to Markdown. Would it be right that the Markdown thing is more that Markdown is very useful for commentary, but not so useful for brainstorming?
I think so. What I like to do, and this is maybe just my kind of personal preference when it comes to collaborating on documents, is being able to share comments with each other. It's nice to be able to click on a phrase, put a comment in there, let other people, talk back and forth on it.
Hillary has a comment which clearly should be accompanied by a smiley emoji. But as a Googler, she's always fine with Google Docs.
Yeah.
For those of you who aren't super familiar with the Markdown workflow on GitHub, it is, implied smiley emoji, says Hillary. I felt it. I could feel it. For those of you who aren't super familiar with GitHub and Markdown, the way we work on GitHub, which is kind of how we approach code, is that we'd leave comments in the issues and then we'd look at the code, i.e. the Markdown, and work there. So it's a workflow where you step away from the document and you read the issues, you go back to the document. You saw it today where I was reading out comments and they were quite separate from the document itself, which is a little different from when we're using Google Docs, where you actually have the document, you see the comment right beside it. So it's a different workflow.
Yeah. It's not to say we wouldn't take an issue either, if people prefer to, collaborate that way.
On a personal level, I'm super familiar with both, so I'm super comfortable with both. But my take is that whatever's needed to get the job done, Markdown is where our canonical documents should be. So release candidates and final releases should be Markdown. But on the collaborative editing front, if the people editing find a Google Doc better, why not? And there will be an issue with China where they can't access Google Docs. And that's where I think we need to be able to provide, let's say, people say that to us, we provide a Word document version, or, they say, we need a snapshot. Okay, here's a snapshot on GitHub.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps what I could do, Shane, is provide a couple versions, or provide also a link to the Markdown version whenever I share a Google Doc version.
Yeah, or here's an idea. The Google Doc allows export into Word format as well. So if we share the Google Doc, just also share the download as Word version.
Okay. No, thank you for that feedback. That sounds great. And if anyone has any other ideas, you can please write onto the mail list or contact me. And then Shane, sorry to use one more minute, but I just wanted to give you a heads up that I'm not sure how the time translation works on the emails going out, but the version I got said this was starting an hour later.
Really interesting.
Yeah, so just FYI, I don't know, there may be some people showing up in 15 minutes. So I've been kind of messed up ever since we had our daylight savings time switch. So
Okay, that's good to know. And the final point you had was, what if we had a separate hour for editing? Nathan, my take is, if an hour call dedicated to editing education is useful, then we should do that.
okay, yeah, that sounds good. So, well, I'll get started on the first round of links, and then maybe I'll talk to you, Shane, about perhaps setting up an editing time. We'll be working on it anyway, and would be fun to do it in a collaborative way. So
Sounds good. Stephen had a note in the comments that the invite was talking about UTC. Was that the invite talking about UTC in a good way, that it was correct, or it was incorrect?
It was correct.
Okay.
I think the UTC in my subject line, I had both. I had PST where I'm at, and also UTC, and the UTC was correct and the PST was not. So
Oh, okay. All right. Fair enough.
All right, so the PST was wrong. Interesting. Okay. All right, I'll double check the PST issue. So now, right now, in Pacific time, it's different time. Okay.
yeah. Well, 8:45 or 8:46 Pacific time.
Okay, good to flag. Thank you very much. I'll make sure that is corrected. That was an unfortunate error, and much appreciate the flagging on that. Okay, so what we have there on the education side is an outcome where if editing is going to be easier with using Google Docs and similar, then we do that. That's how we're going to work on it. And we'll probably have 1 hour deep dives into editing on education, which is something we've done before as well. So we'll just go back to that. And that'll give plenty of time for the brainstorming, which Nathan, you flagged as probably something that's needed and necessary.
Yep. Well, thank you, Shane.
Thank you, Nathan. Any other business from our team on the call? All right, if there's no other business. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Mary, over to you.
Yeah, as when we talk about the education, I have a question or thought. And since we are developing the open source training material for managers recently, and in the OpenChain project, I saw we have this training material focused on the compliance point of view. But when we develop our training material, it will be focused on the open source ecosystem area, all of it, like consumption, distribution, and contribution like this in two different levels. One is focused on the managers, the other one is focused on the developers. So I'm thinking this is quite practical stuff. Do we have this similar stuff in the from the Linux Foundation project? I mean, if every company need to do so, it would be good to have a common one, especially focused on the high-level managers training material.
It's a really good point. And the answer is that a lot of this material exists, but we haven't consolidated it. So we haven't done what you're suggesting into a consolidated slide deck. The global consolidated slide deck was focused on compliance. So maybe education could work on adding more material and having a broader reference training deck as a potential item. Ria, your hand is up. Over to you.
Hi, Shane. Kind of a little bit on that topic that I missed who raised that because I didn't have the attendee window up. But I had reached out to you based on one of these sessions a few months ago, I think, and I've lost the thread because my Slack hides messages that are older than 90 days. But we had talked about maybe starting an initiative to update some of the documentation, I thought.
Right.
And I don't think I heard any more on that. So I was just curious if that was still of interest or.
Absolutely. So a very good question, Ria. For context here, Ria suggested that we do some updates to some of the documentation that looks stale. And this conversation started, I think we started discussing it around September or so, or maybe we started in July, or sorry, August. And what's happened in the meantime is that we took some steps with moving parts of our repository to Markdown to allow us to iterate more easily. And we combined a couple of our work groups, so curriculum and onboarding combined with education. So what we've done is we've put in place the structure to begin the editing process, and we're now beginning to action it. So in essence, we're at the period where we need to do polling and people to say, okay, this document needs the most attention. So in other words, yes, we're ready. And the question is, what document do you think is most broken or would most benefit for improvement? So I think if you could send some suggestions, it might be useful. Nathan, forgive me if I'm putting words in your team's mouth, but it might be useful, to have someone say, oh, this document particularly could do with some improvements. So maybe we could focus on that in the next call.
I don't know if you still have access to the suggestions. I know I made some suggestions. Unfortunately, I don't have access to them anymore in my Slack because the retention policy is taking them out. So if you have access to them or could restart that would be great, and happy to help with that. But I've lost the thread, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely. I'm also being hit by the 90-day problem. So I'm going to try and find another record of the thread and pull back exactly the material you had, and I'll send it to the list.
Awesome. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Ria. And thank you, everyone. That's where we'll begin to wrap up. And we actually got a lot done today. And the stuff we touched on is big. So much appreciated that you were here and you helped run through that. All right, we're wrapping up there. Please have a beautiful day. I will follow up by email and by updating the issues. Forgive me, it might take a few days. We're going to have a few deep dives here with conferences in Japan with a whole chunk of our community face-to-face. But this call, everything's recorded. It's going to go live, and the material from this call is going to feed directly into outcomes on our website and our GitHub. Take care, everyone. Be safe, be happy, be well, and I look forward to the next call. It's wonderful. Everyone came here and contributed so much.
Thanks, Shane.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.